You are listening to a free version of the Majority Report with Sam Steeder. To support this show and get another 15 minutes of daily program, go to majority.fm, please.
The Majority Report with Sam Steeder.
It is Thursday, January 3rd, 2019. My name is Sam Steeder. This is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Washington Post reporter, author of Washington Post Plumline, Greg Sargent, on his book, An Uncivil War, Taking Back Our Democracy in an Age of Trumpian Disinformation and Thunderdome Politics. Also on the program today, Pelosi sworn in, Paul Ryan unemployed. Meanwhile, progressives launch an assault on PAYGO. No progress, however, on the government shutdown. Among other things, SNAP has about 30 days to go. Section 8 housing in jeopardy. But fortunately, Mitt Romney flashes his maverick bona fides by supporting everything Trump does. Democrats plan a series of rather uncomfortable votes for Republicans in the House. And former Blackwater head seeks to double dip. On one side, we're a private occupying force. And on the other side, we're a private mining company extracting resources from those occupied countries.
Synergy.
Meanwhile, the Trump's tax cut, worse than you thought. New Governor Tony Evers on the Wisconsin GOP lame duck assaults on our democracy. He says, sue me. And a new report, de Blasio's Universal Pre-K in New York is working, and it's great. All this and more on today's program. Now, folks, let me just start off by saying that I want to apologize. I lied to you yesterday. We had about 35 people on hold about the end of the show yesterday, and I said, maybe tomorrow what we'll do is we'll just do all phone calls, just to catch up at the beginning of the year. Because people have been on break, and there's a lot of pent up demand, or a lot of pent up demanding. I think it's probably more accurate. And so I lied. We're not doing that today. But tomorrow, I think we'll do that tomorrow. We'll do a week in review, a short week, not a huge amount of news. We'll have some stuff to talk about in terms of the new rules in the House. There's a couple of interesting ones. The PAYGO thing, maybe we'll get into with Greg Sargent here, and we'll talk about it more. But the long and short of it is that the leaders of the Progressive Caucus, Potuk and Jayapal, Pocan, and Jayapal, were supporting the rules package. Jim McGovern, who is the chair of the Rules Committee, also, I wouldn't say he's my congressman, but I think of him that way because he's from Worcester. But very solid progressive, big time. And he says that it can be waived. There is going to be essentially an attempt by the Progressive Caucus to reverse not just the rule, but the statute that undergirds the rule. So we'll have more on that later. There's a couple of other aspects of the new House rules which will implicate Republicans, and we'll deal with stocks, I think, and a congressperson's ability to petty corruption. Every little bit helps. So we will talk more about that tomorrow. We'll take more phone calls. And instead of getting a movie recommendation, we will talk about movies that we saw on the break. So we'll have that going for us tomorrow. Before we get to Greg Sargent, this was odd. Donald Trump decided to have a cabinet meeting. We do have moments of obviously the grand fealty that we usually expect to see in a cabinet meeting, not unlike what we do around this office when we have an office meeting. I like to just assemble everybody here and have them tell me how wonderful I am and how much of an honor it is for all of them to be on the program. But before we get to that clip, let's play this clip where the president, as far as I can tell, is talking about a dream that he had.
It's a different country than it was when I became president. Iran, when I became president, I had a meeting at the Pentagon with lots of generals. They were like from a movie. Better looking than Tom Cruise and stronger. And I had more generals than I've ever seen. And we were at the bottom of this incredible room. I said, this is the greatest room I've ever seen. I saw more computer boards than I think that they make today. And every part of the Middle East and other places that was under attack because of Iran. And I said to myself, wow. I mean, you look at Yemen, you look at Syria, you look at every place. Saudi Arabia was under siege. They were all, I mean, they wanted Yemen because of the long border with Saudi Arabia. That's why they're there, frankly.
What?
But every place was under siege. And I actually asked the question, how do you stop these people? They're all over the place. They had plenty of money. President Obama had just given them $150 billion.
Who was he even talking about? It was like, honestly, it was just like I had this dream. I woke up, I was in the room, and there was computers. There was more computers than had ever been built.
I'm going to use that long border thing I just learned.
There were so many computers. And then I remembered exactly what I memorized for the quiz about Yemen. And I said it. And all the generals liked me. And they said I was
and
great.
They were strong, so strong.
And they were strong, and their
I'll tell you
jawlines were perfect. Not like Tom Cruise.
I feel like Anthony Adamaric should sue Trump for doing this now. Like, I feel like he does that. Like, Trump's not even doing it like Trump did it. He's doing it like Adamaric did.
It's like if Dennis Miller literally started saying bop, bop, bop.
Yeah, exactly.
And then I realized I was becoming myself on a satiric TV show on Comedy Central.
Do we have the clip of him also talking about why Russia invaded Afghanistan? I mean, it is
doing lots of studying.
Yeah.
I'm sure he read Steve Cole's Ghost Wars during the shutdown.
Well, first off, the story that he tells about Russia, like, where could he have gotten this from? I mean,
that's a good question. This is Rachel.
No. I mean, honestly, like,
where did he get that information?
It's beyond Reader's Digest. And, like, he has access to all of these
Bolton.
Advisors, right?
It's Bolton, right?
You think
talking about Iran?
No,
Iran is Bolton. I don't know
Afghanistan.
where the Russia stuff probably does come from conversation with Putin. No
probably,
joke.
Right?
Like, literally. I'm
Listen
not.
to
That's
this.
not.
This
you
is-
don't have to be
this is-
donut
this
to
is
think
Putin.
that. There's
Like,
nowhere else
just
he would have
remember-
had this conversation, or B, gotten this interpretation from.
The reason why the Soviet Union went into Afghanistan was because they had a client government in Afghanistan that was essentially being assaulted by all fronts because they were so oppressive. And the Russians wanted to maintain their client government. But listen to Donald Trump try and explain the Russian, or I should say the Soviet-Afghanistan conflict.
We're going to do something that's right. We are talking to the Taliban. We're talking to a lot of different people. But here's the thing, because you mentioned India. India is there. Russia is there. Russia used to be the Soviet Union. Afghanistan made it Russia because they went bankrupt fighting in Afghanistan, Russia. So you take a look at other countries. Pakistan is there. They should be fighting. But Russia should be fighting. The reason Russia was in Afghanistan was because terrorists were going into Russia. They were right to be there. The problem is it was a tough fight. And literally they went bankrupt. They went into being called Russia again as opposed to the Soviet Union. A lot of these places you're reading about now are no longer part of Russia because of Afghanistan.
So that's really inaccurate. I mean, that's the kind of inaccuracy that it's hilarious to hear him say, and he probably did hear from Putin. But it's also like the broader fear mongering and a just complete lack of historical information could lead a lot of people, I bet, to accept that interpretation.
Definitely.
And the Russians specifically, with their own sort of imperial projection, you got to connect that understanding to justifying what they do in Chechnya. They run their own Islamophobic foreign policy.
And then they take the part about how, it turned him into Russia. I could understand if he was trying to explain this to a 5-year-old, but he's sitting in a room full of people who theoretically, at least, have a fairly sophisticated understanding of world politics.
I can't believe I'm doing this, but do you think he was, and again, purely recycled from Putin, was he trying to say, and this, a factor in the Soviet Union collapsing was how much they were bled out by fighting that war. Is he trying to say that in a dumb way?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. I don't think it certainly wasn't the only reason why.
But it was a big factor. No,
it was a big factor. No doubt. But I'm saying, he's so dumb that he doesn't have the ability to express that, the Soviet Union broke up. But
they called it Russia again.
But it turned him into Russia.
They had a big meeting, and that guy
this is how you would explain
Boris Yeltsin.
This is how you would explain it to a 5-year-old.
He loved me.
But you're in a room of exclusively adults, sophisticated adults, and you figure out that he's not explaining it to a 5-year-old. He's a 5-year-old.
I'm sorry, tangent and petty tangent. Has Jonathan Chait written a piece about this yet?
Right.
Because I would very much like to see what kind of fever dream that's.
It's like renaming a building. They had to rename it.
They had to rename the building.
The naming rights. They had to sell the naming rights.
That's how he. Yes.
All right. We got to take a break. When we come back, we will talk to Greg Sargent about his book, An Uncivil War, and find out if we can ever recover from any of this ever. We'll see. We'll be right back. Just change the name.
I hear a sound above my head, distant sound of thunder, booming out on the moor. Black
We are back. Sam Cedar on the Majority Report on the phone. A pleasure to welcome to the program. He is a Washington Post opinion writer, the author of Washington Post Plumline, and author of his latest, An Uncivil War, Taking Back Our Democracy in an Age of Trumpian Disinformation and Thunderdome Politics. We'll put a link at majority.fm. Greg Sargent, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me on.
So, Greg, it's a real pleasure to have you on. I read you almost on a daily basis, and have for a long time. Probably, I think, I don't know, when Talking Points memo.
The old TPM days.
Right. So you're this is pretty OG stuff here on some level, because the argument, and I think this audience is well versed with the machinations, the implications of gerrymandering and self-sorting to the extent that has taken place. I think this audience is fairly well briefed on the assault on our democracy and the norms. But let's talk a little bit about that. I mean, place Trump in context within the modern Republican Party as to what is straining our system, if you will.
Well, the case I make in the book is that, Trump represents both an exacerbation of and a kind of exploitation of long-running trends. So, to talk about the topics that you brought up, I mean, here's a guy who took the conventional Republican complaints about voter fraud, which Republicans have been, claiming for many years as a justification for suppressing the vote of Democratic constituencies. And he took that claim and ramped it up to a kind of cartoon level of hyperbole and warning that really, pushes it to an entirely different place, right? He went out there and I think I talked to historians about this, and I really couldn't find another example of it in American history. But he explicitly and openly in the run-up to the election said, the outcome of the election won't be legitimate unless I win it. Now, that's not something we've heard before, and it's a fundamental break in certain ways from what we've heard from Republicans in the past. In the 2018 elections, he went out there and he essentially did the same thing, kind of attacking. He lent the White House's imprimatur to voter fraud by saying in pretty much every forum that he could that voter fraud is a real thing and we need to watch out for it. That's the President of the United States endorsing voter suppression tactics. I mean, we've seen some of that under Bush, but this was really a different level entirely. And so the case I make in the book is that he couldn't have done this if Republican audiences hadn't been primed for it for many years. But on the other hand, he's taking it to a level of irresponsibility and recklessness that I don't think we can say we've seen before.
Right, and so and you make the case that any solutions to something like this have to sort of go beyond Trump. But let's talk about some of the other problems that exacerbate this, because I am with you in that dynamic there. That Trump was sort of the natural progression, but maybe it crosses a line that just makes it a little bit more cartoonish. But in some respects, I mean, you talk about also the way that Trump lies. Let's talk about that. But I also, because of your history in covering this stuff, and particularly sort of with a somewhat critical eye to the media, I see a similar progression between the way that the press deals with Donald Trump lying and the way that the press dealt with, frankly, Paul Ryan lying. He would lie about different things, but there was a sense that, nobody challenged Paul Ryan on stuff that everyone sort of knew was BS. But what do you think about that point?
Yeah, look, I think that's a legitimate point, and we can't let the criticism of Trump distract us from what we've seen from the Republican Party for many years, for sure. But on the other hand, it really is true that Trump represents a bit of a break from conventional Republican practices when it comes to the press as well. I mean, if you look at the level of lying, it's really, I think it really is important to understand it as a kind of, a sort of quasi-totalitarian style of disinformation that is in some respects new and is in some respects placing new strains on the press and the media. We just haven't seen this kind of concerted level of intense, nonstop, in repetitive dishonesty and disinformation from the White House before. I mean, you could argue that the consequences of Bush's lying were worse in certain ways. I mean, the Iraq War and so forth. But this still is a sort of level of destructive lying that is its own thing, right? And you have to pair that with the way he's attacked the press, which is also something a bit different. I think you could look back at other Republican presidents who have attacked the press, like Nixon and so forth, and W. And obviously Obama tangled with the press, and he had his own terrible anti-media conduct in the form of the intense efforts to ferret out leaks. But what Trump's doing is casting the media as a fundamentally illegitimate institutionally illegitimate, right? Not having a real and functional role in our democracy. I think no president has quite done it this way. Even other presidents like Nixon, who tangled with the press, still maintained the general sense that the press played a fundamental institutional role in a democracy, right?
Right.
And Trump, by contrast, really is trying to obliterate that role. It's really something new.
I mean, it's something new from the context of a president, right? But it seems like this dynamic was ongoing. I mean, I remember back in the blogger days, you would have right-wing critique of the press and left-wing critique of the press. And the left-wing critique of the press accepted the premise of the press, right? It basically said, like, we just want you to do better in these instances, as opposed to the right-wing critique of the press, which was that it was fundamentally dishonest and couldn't be trusted, period. And
right, that's a real distinction for sure, yeah.
And so where does that lead? What is Trump able to come in and do this because of something unique with Trump, or was there already a failure? And I'm not saying necessarily of the administration. Go ahead.
The story I tell in the book is sort of. I agree with you that in the sense that I think what you're saying is that Trump couldn't have done this if the groundwork hadn't been laid for it. And I think that's absolutely right. And that's the story I tell in the book, which is that we keep hearing about the declining confidence in the media and in our institutions, but that's largely a Republican phenomenon. I have a lot of data in there which essentially shows that it's mostly Republicans that have turned on the media. And I agree. The story I tell there is that we've had decades and decades of conservative attacks on the press that have essentially been fundamentally different from the liberal critique of the press. The left accepts the fundamental and core liberal democratic values of the media and accepts that the press has a core institutional role to play. The right is trying to really delegitimize that role, and I don't think you could have had Trump step in and do this if Republican audiences hadn't been primed by that message for many years. I still think, though, even though that's the case, in Trump there's a kind of intensity and frequency and audacity to the disinformation that just seems to me to be something a bit different, especially when you pair it with the outright casting of the media as the enemy of the people, which, that's just, there's a level of recklessness and really an effort to, I think, incite violence against the media. I don't think that's an overstatement, right? I mean, think about this. go to Robert Chain, right? Remember when Robert Chain was arrested for allegedly leaving threatening voicemails for reporters at the Boston, I believe it was the Boston Globe, wasn't it?
Uh-huh.
He was literally parroting Trump's language while threatening the lives of people. Now, a president who hears that news, what you'd think would say to himself, you know what, maybe I'm pushing this a little too far. I could be responsible for a bloodbath one of these days, right? But he went out and repeated the language, like within 48 hours. And that seems to me to be a level of incitement that I'm not sure we've seen before.
Okay, so what is going on? I mean, what is that? Because he's just crazy? I mean, the funny thing is that the ground was softened, and I think it was softened.
Right.
It was softened largely by design, right? Like, I don't know that people were anticipating that Donald Trump there, but like. My metaphor about Donald Trump and the Republican Party, that the voter that supports him, is that they created a Frankenstein, and then Frankenstein got out of the laboratory and just started running amok in the village, and they couldn't catch him. There was a strategy to undermine the press. There was a strategy to undermine science, a long-term strategy, it seems to me, of the conservative movement to do this. Trump comes in and kicks it to another level because the ground has been softened. But he doesn't. Do you think he's doing it as a strategy, or is it just more of like he's just like a trapped animal, and the ground was softened enough that type of animal could become president? I'm mixing a lot.
It's very hard to say with him.
Right.
Yeah, I mean. It's very hard to say with him where instinct ends and conscious deliberative design begins, but you can say that his background very much conditioned him for this. His reality TV background was really a long exercise in experimenting with how you can remake reality through sheer force of personality, right? And Steve Bannon came along, and Steve Bannon is a worshiper of totalitarian propagandists. This has been documented in Josh Green's excellent biography of Bannon. And so the kind of meeting of their two minds is, I think, instructive. Bannon knew that he had a fellow traveler in Trump instantly, right? How did he know this? He saw Trump experimenting with this sort of type of quasi-totalitarian disinformation. He understood Trump to be using the force of personality to remake reality, right? And so how much of it is instinct, how much of it is conditioning, how much of it is conscious, it's hard to say. There are times when he seems to be lying solely because he knows it's pissing off the people who he thinks he should be pissing off, right? And so I don't know. We can kind of go down a rabbit hole endlessly trying to figure out how carefully crafted a strategy it is. It's just an approach, I think, is the way to think about it, that maybe has taken on a cultural life of its own under Trump. And I don't know what to say other than that about it. I feel like it is in some key ways it can be seen as deliberate, because he seems to know that he can rub out any kind of collective agreement on facts, or at least that he seems to want to do that. I think he clearly understands that that's what he's trying to do.
Well, I guess the question is relevant only insofar as, is it that he is so good at this, or is it that our system is so weakened that it is susceptible to this? Right? Like where, like what? Right. I mean, that to me seems to be the relevance of that question. Is just that is it he is a genius, or is it that like we as a country are because our institutions have been so weakened, or because and I want to sort of start to focus on the media, because presumably, right, this is one of the key institutions that's supposed to sort of guard against this, has been so undermined that we're susceptible to it.
Well, I'd give a double answer to that. My take on this, and this is what I discuss in the book. I think it's true, as you say, that one of the big stories, at least of the 2016 election, was that Trump really did find a way to exploit some really profound institutional weaknesses on the part of the media. That was evident in numerous ways. As I recount in the book, there were extensive examples of running of the rallies unfiltered, with news executives even admitting at one point that they were doing it for the purposes of ratings and that it was irresistible to them. Then there was also Trump skillfully exploiting what we all call both sidesism of the media, in which the press simply couldn't refrain from placing a kind of equivalent question mark over the heads of both Hillary Clinton and Trump, even though Hillary Clinton was at worst, right, maybe being dishonest in a very conventional political way, whereas Trump had been had been for many months engaged in a kind of level of disinformation that was clearly something else entirely. So those two institutional weaknesses right there were very clearly exploited by Trump. And by the way, you saw that very high negatives for both candidates, right? And many polls showed that people viewed Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump as equivalently dishonest, which was an amazing thing, right? But I think since then, the press has actually started to find its footing. I don't think it's a done deal for sure, but my view of this is that the strategy on Trump's part, at least as used from the White House, is essentially failing, and that our institutions are holding up more or less, especially the press. I think there are plenty of flaws, but look at that last election, right? I mean, they ran one of the most virulently xenophobic campaigns I think we've ever seen, or at least definitely not in recent memory, with really a level of lying and propaganda that was extraordinary, and it just failed completely, right? The press was pretty good on covering that stuff. It really showed, it showcased the degree to which Trump was lying about the migrants and so forth and so on. And so now if you look at the Mueller probe, right, there's the public confidence in it is strong. Polling on that's been stable for, 18 months. So I don't know. I feel like our institutions are kind of rebounding in the face of Trump, really.
But because it's funny that you say the migrants, because I was going to cite the caravan as a perfect example of the failure of the press. I mean, it didn't work, right? Like, I mean, it's quite possible that that the election's outcome was sort of predetermined on some level. But the enormous coverage of the caravan, like literally of the caravan, not of Donald Trump is talking about this caravan as if it's a real thing, right? I mean, he could have been sitting there saying, Santa Claus is coming. Santa Claus is coming with an evil crew of reindeer. And the press wouldn't be going up to the North Pole to look for these evil reindeer. They would just say, like, he's saying that there's these evil reindeer coming, like that. And that gives me pause. And then just as recently as like the past couple of days, I got a clip of MSNBC talking about the new Mavericks, Mitt Romney and Ben Sass. And
great.
Well, but honestly, it's like, wait a second. Are you serious? The both sidisms, like Trump is so ridiculous that I think it makes it like almost impossible for the press to do what the press sort of seems to knee-jerk want to do, broadly speaking. But in any other opportunity, Mitt Romney, literally coming out and saying, I'm going to vote with the president on almost everything. In fact, I can't come up with anything I'm not going to vote with him on, but I'm going to come out and say when I think he's being a jerk. Like, what is the value of that in the context of our politics?
Right. I mean, first to the caravan, I think you raise a legitimate point. I want to add a nuance, though. So it's true that Trump controlled the narrative of the campaign to the degree that the press really did relentlessly cover the caravan. But at the same time, I think the coverage actually backfired on them, and it's precisely because the coverage was actually pretty good, putting aside whether it was the right news judgment to cover it as much as they did, right? They really did humanize a lot of the figures in the caravan, and a lot of the coverage really did aggressively debunk Trump's lies about it being riddled with criminals and terrorists and so forth. And there, a lot of the press was pretty aggressive in really casting it as a fear-mongering, xenophobic, propagandistic campaign strategy. And so even Republicans, from the news reporting that I've read, have admitted that Trump's focus on that backfired for them terribly in the suburbs, right? And leading to the wipeout. So I don't know. I feel like it was actually covered in some ways somewhat responsibly. It's nuanced, but I think we have to say that in no way did his sort of quote-unquote master manipulation of the press work for him in that case.
Right. Fair enough. And so let's move on to this sort of the idea of the press like desperately needing to have a reasonable Republican, even if they can't really find that one. Right? Like, I mean,
yeah, that's depressing.
Like honestly, if like someone from TMZ started criticizing a celebrity, I would say that's ineffectual. Like the idea that Mitt Romney is being hailed as a maverick because he's willing to say Donald Trump is rude, I think is just sort of shocking, right?
It is. I think it's symptomatic of something bigger that I think that you're getting at here, which is that the press really has, this is a generalization, but in sort of an institutional sense, the press has really had trouble conveying the basic truth about what's happened to the Republican Party. And I think that's the problem you're getting at. They just so badly don't want to admit what it's become that they'll seize on almost anything to tell the opposite story, right?
Yeah.
So Paul Ryan... It took many leading commentators literally years to figure out what most of us had figured out early on, which is that the guy was a total fiscal fraud, right? And there was just this effort to try and cast him as a serious foil to Obama that was just so riddled with BS, right? So there's that example. Then Romney comes along and the broader thing here is that the never Trumpers often kind of get a kid glove kind of treatment from the news media that I think is symptomatic of this problem. That They so badly want to portray the Republican Party as somehow not really responsible for Trump or somehow distinct and separate from Trump that they often kind of hype up these never Trumpers into something that they really don't deserve the heroic label for.
No, I agree totally. And I think this is like deeply problematic. And it undergirds, I mean, a lot of like the dynamics that you're talking about in the book. I mean, at one point in your book, you asked the question of, and we have seen from, I mean, at least, just going back 15, 20 years or so, everything from the election in 2000 to, I'm talking about the sort of the politicization of stuff that was supposed to be sort of norms in some respect, the firing of the U.S. attorneys, which was sort of the first milestone, I guess, of the voter fraud initiative by the Republican Party,
right.
And going through the ages, ending with Mitch McConnell not holding a hearing for Merrick Garland. I mean, these are all abuses of the norms. We had campaigns can get very nasty, but I remember Max Cleland, being morphed into Osama bin Laden. This is a guy who was I think he was a quadriplegic who had lost all his limbs in Vietnam. You argue, though, that the Democrats, how should they respond to this? Let's say, with the idea that it's possible they're going to have significantly more power over the next 2 or 3 years. How should they respond to this?
Well, so a couple things. So one of the stories I tell in the book, I try to go back to Gingrich as the starting point for a lot of this, which is something that a lot of political scientists also think. He actually deserves outsized historic importance in what's happening today, And And look, there's been norm violations on both sides. There's been constitutional hardball on both sides. And it's important to recognize that, but it's also important to recognize how asymmetric the constitutional hardball has been. Republicans really have played it in a much more destructive fashion over the years. And so the case I make is that Democrats need to be cognizant of that reality going forward, and they can't unilaterally disarm by obeying a sort of set of conventional norms that Republicans simply refuse to obey. But at the same time, I think they can't kind of follow the right over the cliff into procedural nihilism either. I think progressives and Democrats have to stand for something better. We have to stand for better democracy, for liberal democracy. And to the degree that norm violations can cross over into seriously illiberal behavior, I argue that that's something we don't want to do, and we don't have to do. And so the case I make is for a balance between not unilaterally disarming, which means escalating where it's appropriate and where it's justified and with some care, but at the same time moving wherever possible to kind of opportunistically take off the table some of the tactics, the counter-majoritarian and hardball tactics that Republicans have used. And taking them off the table means taking them off the table for both sides, essentially disarmament, right? If that makes any sense.
Well, what does it look like in practice? I mean, we hear now, because you say, let's get rid of the filibuster, which will make things far more democratic in the context of the Senate. Yet, Chuck Schumer and a couple others are saying in the Senate, like, maybe restoration of those norms involves the return of the filibuster, right? Like these things.
Right, that's a mistake for sure. I think returning to the filibuster on nominations and judicial and executive nominations is utter folly. I do argue for taking some caution in getting rid of the filibuster on legislation, right? But so to your question, no, I don't say that we should definitely in an unqualified way rule it out. I just think we should treat it as something we should be careful about. But to your question, we're actually seeing some of this disarming that I'm talking about happen right now. The Democrats are going to be introducing a package of reforms tomorrow that includes a push for automatic voter registration and also nonpartisan redistricting commissions and a beefed-up Voting Rights Act. These are the types of things that you can pursue either on the federal or the state level that fit into this category that I'm talking about of disarming these tactics on both sides. So nonpartisan redistricting commissions have the virtue of ending partisan gerrymandering basically as a tactic, right? And we saw, I think, 3 of them pass in referendums on the state level in the 2018 elections. And, you know, that's an example. And also remember what happened in New Jersey when Democrats tried their own hideous gerrymander. A lot of progressives spoke out forcefully against it, and they dropped it. I think that's a good model. I don't think we want to go out there and say, well, they gerrymandered, so we're going to gerrymander. Democrats do have a long history of doing it themselves, but to be clear, but after what we saw from Republicans from 2010 onwards, where they really souped up the tactic to unbelievable levels, we don't want to play that game anymore. We want to end it.
Right. So the idea is to push more of a protect the institutions of democracy agenda, which will, for those of us who are partisan in this conversation, will ultimately, at least we think, benefit the left, broadly speaking, because the people who are disenfranchised tend to be people who are more amenable to the left. What about things like when you so that's the democracy agenda when we talk about increasing voting rights, and maybe even in some reforms in the House. One of the things they're passing, I think probably as we speak or shortly afterwards, will be the Gephardt rule, which, you know, no longer allows for the debt ceiling to become a hostage in negotiations. Presumably, at least in the context of when the Democrats control the House, which is a good thing. What about things like, obviously you can't pass these agendas any more than the Democrats can pass the other agendas we're talking about, because the Senate may or may not go along with it. But what about things like card check? What about strengthening institutions? Where does that fit in your in the matrix of what is and is not appropriate within the context of sort of maintaining some structure of norms?
Well, let me just back up for a second and say that the debt ceiling thing you're talking about is a perfect example of this, right? So many leading Republicans, when they played debt ceiling brinkmanship, none of them wanted us to default. They understood how destructive it was, but they used it as a bargaining tactic, as a hostage-taking tactic. And that was incredibly destructive. And so now this is something that can be disarmed for both sides, right?
Right.
And so now that's getting taken off the table, and hopefully, if Republicans take back the House, it'll stay that way. But I should also point out that it's not hopeless, by the way. We did see nonpartisan redistricting commissions pass in a few states. We saw automatic voter registration in Michigan in 2018. Automatic voter registration, a huge reform. It's passing in state after state. I think it's up over a dozen now, right? These are really potentially transformative over time. If we can get these things through on the state level and state after state, it really adds up. I think we need to think of this as something we can do and not something that's hopeless.
Let's talk just a little bit about what do you think about something like card check, where the Democratic Party comes in and starts to also look at things that aren't necessarily sort of process, I guess, of votes or initiatives, but are aimed at solidifying their power, but in a way that I personally think that we have a disequilibrium between labor and capital, strengthening the hand of unions.
Well, I'm all for that. I don't see that. I don't see that as any kind of norm violation. I don't see why it would be. I mean, that's the important dividing line should be between conduct that is fundamentally destructive to democratic institutions and democratic relations, and conduct which we should, I think of as something we don't want to do, stuff that really crosses over into illiberal conduct, right? And then on the better side of the line, stuff that essentially constitutes winning the argument in politics, which is really the bread and butter of things, right? So if Democrats can get stuff through that strengthens unions, yes, that helps them politically, but that's to me, I don't see why that's a hardball tactic in the same kind of way. It's essentially, this is the give and take of politics, right? Sometimes you win, sometimes the majority wins and gets its way. We just want to, I think, stay away from the type of procedural nihilism that the right has engaged in, which really is something much more destructive, is fundamentally illiberal, and is not something we need to do, I don't think, to win.
Do you think there's a big push for that?
Well, it's a little hard to say. I mean, I think there was, right? There's going to be a very big debate about how far Democrats should go. I think some of left Twitter sometimes wants to see things like Democrats being willing to really go whole hog into very aggressive gerrymandering and even potentially things like voter suppression, if only in order to get Republicans to stop doing that stuff. I'm not for that. I don't think we need to do that. I think if we make the system more democratic over time, we make it, we make it more amenable to majority rule, our ideas win.
All right. Lastly, I want to just touch on this because I found this fascinating, and I saw it first in the form of I think a tweet thread when you were talking about Ben Wickler, who was recently was recently the Move On communications director, also former Air America producer, I should say, but. He had a fascinating insight about the asymmetry when it came to something like the government shutdown. So let's tell us about that story, and then let's just talk about this shutdown lastly to get a sense of where we are with this.
Sure. Well, so in the book, one thing that I discuss is the asymmetric incentives between the two parties, which is one of the things, the deeper structural reasons that Republicans end up playing so much more constitutional hardball than Democrats do. And the story that I used to illustrate this, it comes from Wickler, who you just introduced, and he essentially recounts that as the political guy for Move On, during the shutdown that Democrats tried to stage a year ago over the fate of the Dreamers, he and left-wing groups, liberal groups, went to leading Democrats and presented them with polling saying, we think this data shows that if you hold firm, you'll win this shutdown fight and they'll have to cave. And, of course, that didn't happen. Democrats caved within a couple days, and the message that was sent back to the liberal groups from some of these senators was, we really just couldn't take the heat from the mainstream criticism of us. And as Wickler points out, that is a deep asymmetry. The Republicans really don't care as much what the quote-unquote MSM, the responsible centrist media, says about them. They listen to the right-wing media. Democrats, by contrast, are very attuned to what the mainstream press says about them. And so there you have a really fundamental and deep asymmetry between the two parties. And I had actually a really interesting exchange with Dan Pfeiffer and Jean Favreau about this the other day. They were saying that there are ways to deal with this asymmetry. They posit that Democrats need to find ways to communicate with their voters kind of around the press in a way that Republicans have done, yet without doing what you and I talked about early in this conversation, which is essentially trying to delegitimize the mainstream press in the process. Now, I don't know exactly what that'll look like over time, but it seems generally to me like a good idea. I mean, Democrats need to develop the conversation they're having with their voters a little more. A Democratic operative said something very interesting to me the other day. He said, I think Trump and Republicans have a conversation going with their voters 24/7 in a way that we, meaning Democrats, just don't quite understand. And I think that's something we need to all think about.
How much of that do you think is because there is something fundamentally about the conservative movement. I don't know about the Republican Party, but about the conservative movement that is anti-democratic. That is, fundamentally, right? I mean, philosophically, ideologically, the libertarian roots of this is fundamentally anti-democratic.
Right.
And that there's a consistency and an understanding there. But, when Chuck Schumer or, and I can't remember who the other senator was that had come out saying maybe when we get control of the Senate, we should reinstitute the filibuster.
Yeah.
That to me is like, they don't want to have that conversation because the reasons why you want to bring back the filibuster are inconsistent with stated values, right? And it is true, I think, that that Barack Obama fell victim to a misunderstanding of this asymmetry. But I also think it was true that his politics were to the right of where I think the Democratic Party, I'm talking about your average voter, thought they were. And there was some value for him in not necessarily having an open and frank conversation, right? It took a long time before he pulled Social Security cuts off the table. And that was because he couldn't get them to say yes to it. So it was becoming a liability. But I don't think that was just about, I'm going to be bipartisan. I think it was like, I happen to believe, I happen to believe that we should do this. And, that's his prerogative, but he may also be aware that this isn't something I really want to advertise too much with the Democratic Party.
Well, I think that's true. And can I add something about Obama on this that, and ironically enough, is really deeply misunderstood by the right? Obama, it's true. I don't know if he personally thinks cutting Social Security is a good idea, but I do think that in his mind that he thinks bipartisan compromises are good, and that's how the system should function. And he's probably more willing than many progressives are to give away things to get that. And the cynical interpretation of that is that Obama cared deeply about his brand as a kind of transcendent and unifying and bipartisan figure and so forth. The less cynical one is that he's an institutionalist who believes that this really is how the system should function. But it's true. I mean, I think.
But there's a third option too, right? There's a third option, and that is that he genuinely believed that the way the world operates is such that you don't want to create this moral hazard for, the regulars, right? I mean, he's surrounded by, Reubenites, and they certainly bought into the idea, like, you wouldn't want to give homeowners a break on their mortgage because that creates a moral hazard. You got to do it for the banks because they're the ones who are in charge of the system. I mean, that's a political ideology. And, he may also think that, like, we can strike a deal because I'm actually closer to you guys than you think. And it just turned out they were even that much crazier. They were even that much further to the right. But there is a third option there.
Fortunately for us, right?
Right. Exactly. But there is a third option there, that he is just more to the right than most Democratic voters understood. And they didn't want that conversation too intimately with those voters because they didn't want those voters to be too aware of it.
Right. I think there's a lot to that. He's definitely a center-left figure rather than a more progressive one. I don't think there's any doubt. I think there are some areas where it's a little difficult to say whether that was the real driver. I tend to doubt that he wouldn't have wanted to get the public option or Medicare down to 55.
Right.
I think those are probably things that he would think is a good idea, but I don't know that. And I think you raise an important point about him. But let me say this though: I think those days are past. The Democratic Party now is just in a different place. If you look at who's running for president now, you've got Elizabeth Warren, you've got Bernie Sanders, you've got discussions about Medicare for all dominating. It's simply impossible for me to imagine the nominee being in that same kind of place that you're talking about, in that kind of same center-left economic space. There's just, I think part of it, by the way, ironically, is what you raised, which is the truly reactionary and plutocratic nature of the Republican Party is so unavoidable now that there's no real percentage in talking about meeting them in the middle on some of this stuff. And so that's having a bit of a liberating effect for the conversation among Democrats, don't you think? I mean, I
do.
Right? I mean,
I do. Like, nobody's going to believe we can reach across the aisle. Although I got to say, and what gives me sort of shivers about this is that, I don't need to use any names. I don't want to put you in any type of discomfort. But the same guy who realizes 5 or 10 years too late that Paul Ryan was actually a charlatan this whole time, tweets out today, we should really take Mitt Romney's op-ed seriously. And it's like, what? Where was this?
Yeah.
We rinse, repeat. I mean, that's crazy to me. So
I think I know what you're talking about there.
I mean, that's
right.
It's just, you can, and somehow the tweet just got on top of the board here on TV. But actions ultimately speak louder than words. But Romney's op-ed is meaningful, a real risk from a usually risk-averse politician. But that's not true. There's simply no risk associated with that. He comes from Utah. Utah does not particularly like Donald Trump. They love his policies, but they think he's rude. And that's all that he's doing. Mitt Romney has gone as far as Mitt Romney's going to go, which is, you are rude, sir, and I will vote for all of your policies. And that is
right.
Useless. It is. It's less than useless. I mean, it's.
I agree. Yeah. I mean, I just want to reiterate though, the Democratic Party is in such a different place now.
Right.
This kind of, this kind of gravitational pull that the elite centrists used to have. I just think it's a less important force these days, and it's not something to worry too much about.
Well, I will take your word for it, and
I hope I'm right.
me too. Greg, pleasure talking to you. The book is Uncivil War, Taking Back Our Democracy in an Age of Trumpian Disinformation and Thunderdome Politics. Fascinating read to get a sense of just sort of these dynamics that take place that are not as much ideological as much as it is sort of like this weird sort of... I guess it's just politics. Greg Sargent, thanks so much for your time today. We'll put a link to the book at majority.fm.
Great. Thanks for having me on. Much appreciated.
All right, folks, we're going to take a quick break and head into the fun half of the program. And again, tomorrow we will take, we'll go all in on calls tomorrow and IMs, and we'll make it... like a full-on freebie Friday tomorrow. But just a reminder, you can support this program by going to jointhemajority.report.com, and by becoming a member, you get access to the extra content that we have after the show. Or you get, sometimes bonus content like that... that 90 minutes of my smug condescension to a guy, calling him a grifter to his face. That was quite liberating.
It was anemic.
Explaining to him.
I chose my words very carefully. Let me just say, I chose my words very carefully. If you haven't seen the debate, if you're not giving yourself the privilege of being a member of this show, you don't know what I'm talking about. But if you did, you know how funny that is.
Yeah, we're in the verge of making a poster for the live show, and apathetically steamrolling the truth may even make it on there. I think
it really encapsulates what we're all about here at the Majority Report.
It'd be good if we monetize that.
Yeah, we should. Really great. I'm sorry, Brandon. Hi, this is I'm calling from the law firm of Levin, Kratz and Levin, and I just wanted to let you know that you're using a trademark term that is trademarked by Sam Cedar.
Yo, we put a trademark. We very consciously chose that trademark. We chose it very carefully.
It's our brand, apathetically steamrolling the truth on a daily basis.
Nonchalantly trademarking the truth in that case.
That part where I just got to, it's a spoiler, but just the way it actually devolves into like, Sam is, by the way, in pedagogy would be horrible, but basically a condescending, frustrated / cynically amused middle school teacher with like a particularly not able to understand information student who also happens to be extremely aggressive. Like,
yes,
not like, how can I get my way out of this C-, but like, you don't get it. My C- is an A+. Right. And you're just like, no, it would be an A+ if you did it.
It was fun. All right, folks. Anyways. All right. So join themajority.report.com. Also, justcoffee.coop, fair trade coffee, tea, or chocolate. Use the coupon code majority to get 10% off. As always, too, we're working on filling out our website. We because of all the regulations in our regulatory state, we're not allowed to fill out our website for 13 months after it's been built.
No. It would be in that vein. It would be like we're proactively not filling out our website.
Right. Well, it's because of the regulatory state, and we're waiting for regulations to be rolled back. But if you ever want to look for one of our advertising deals that we have, just Google the company and Majority Report, and it will take you usually to the podcast description and you can find the deal that way. Today is Thursday, not Tuesday. However, it is the day that this week we'll be presenting the Michael Brooks Show. Is that correct?
Correct. Bhaskar Sunkara in studio. We're talking about Sanders and Warren. We're going to break it down, and reformism versus sort of more structural change, 60th anniversary of the Cuban Revolution, Haiti, bunch of other stuff, packed the labor unrest in Sudan. It's a jam-packed show. I do want to say really quick for patrons, the one that we released on Sunday, the first of the year, Not Enough, Human Rights in an Unequal World by Samuel Moyne at Yale Law, was brilliant and typical of the sort of like counter-intellectual histories and good stuff we do for patrons. Patreon.com/TMBS tonight around 7-ish on the Michael Brooks Show YouTube channel.
Jamie, the Antifada.
Yeah, so there's no new episode this week. However, last week we posted a very long episode, so people have lots and lots of time to listen to it. We had on Dr. Nerve V. Makaspak to talk about the history of Maoist insurgencies in the Philippines and the rise of Rodrigo Duterte, plus Marxist geography, presidential foot fetishes, and more. Oh, and also, we just got to the very cool number 420 of patrons, so pretty excited about that.
You got to stop at 420. You gotta
Nice.
stop for a while.
Right? But there's another even better number that we're trying to get to called 666. And when we do that, we're going to send all of our $5 and up patrons Dr. Antifada's deluxe prize pack containing stickers and probably some other stuff.
Right. Other witchcraft.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Satan stuff.
Exactly. Satan stuff.
And Matt?
Yeah, check out the Literary Hangover. Soon for members, actually this weekend, I just have to proof listen to it, is part 1 of 2 of the second volume of Hope Leslie for all you Hope heads out there. And there's about 1,000 of you. So that's going up for members this weekend.
You got that market cornered. It totally. Yeah.
Dude likes dropping New Hope.
All right, folks. 646-257-3920 is the number. See you in the fun half.